Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairy Tales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, you're on Varietal Literature's YouTube channel, a place where we just kind of a cozy place for narrative. And what we do on Tuesday nights is we read old folklore and fairy tales, some of which only recently has been translated. Some of the translators are acquaintances of mine. And in the case of tonight, we're going to be reading stories from Regine Normann, who is a Norwegian folklorist and writer in her own capacity. She was from the 19th century. We've read works from her before, and they're always just stunning stories. She is a absolutely remarkable writer. I definitely encourage you to stick around and listen to some of her stories if you like the folklore style of writing. She sort of borders between fairy tale and folklore. The collection that we're reading from tonight is called Ringelahorn. That's not how it's pronounced, but when I tried to before, it didn't work out well. I'll get it one day. But it is a collection that she put out originally in Norwegian, but has been translated by Simon Roy Hughes, who is a contemporary and who quite recently translated these works. Every story, we're going to do 2 stories probably tonight. You'll know by checking the timestamps down below. By the way, if you're new here, there will be timestamps in the description, which allow you to jump ahead to whatever part of the show interests you the most. If you're just curious about, I don't know, the title might have changed by the time you watch it, but the original title was Why Would Robbers Till the Land for Free? Or something to that effect. If you're just curious about the answer to that question, it will be the first story tonight, which is called The Quick-Witted Woman. And you can feel free to jump ahead and skip over the beginning if that's all that interests you. If you are here live, though, there is a live chat, and I always really enjoy seeing people's comments, and I know that the translators do as well. So feel free to join in, whether it's little rounds of applause for how marvelous I do. That's a joke, but if you want to comment on the weirdness of old tales, because there are weird things. But yeah, we're reading translations from Simon Roy Hughes, who is a wonderful gentleman that who's currently translating as Bjornson and Moe, who are sort of the Grimm brothers of Norwegian folklore, who we've also read from that collection, though that is not published yet. If you do want to support Simon Roy Hughes, I will have a pinned comment with his Amazon page where you can go and order these books, including Ringelahorn by Regine Normann, which we're reading from tonight. And you should, because, it's not exactly the high-budget, high-pay work to be a translator of old lore, but it is all the same important. Okay. Just as a couple of side notes, the smoke is still clearing away if you were here in previous weeks. We have a lot of wildfire smoke in my province. The smoke is still clearing away. So at times I may have to clear my voice or whatever else because basically there's a lot of smoke in the air. But thankfully it has started raining. The downside to that is the flip side is now it's incredibly humid. So it's helping with the smoke, but we'll see how the heat holds up because if it gets too hot, I may have to cut it early. I'm going to have a drink of water, though, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight's stories, and then we're going to read the stories. Janera's in the chat. Hello, Janera. Lovely to see you here tonight. So just very briefly, there isn't a lot of complexity to tonight's theme. The themes are always kind of thin. Mostly I just want to read stories, but the themes tonight are something that comes up a lot in folklore, which is either the wife, it's more often the wife than anyone else, but we're going to see an example of not a wife being this way as well. The wife or a princess or some old woman or whatever else being the wisest person in the room, or the most learned or the most intelligent about the situation, however you want to put it. And I do find it an interesting contrast because in every other respect, a lot of the time women are not granted much respect in these tales because it comes from a time when, women were property to be traded off for marriage. So I always find it interesting, that contrast. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago in one of the shows, how women were often seen as the sort of moral arbiters of things. Who the woman chose was the most moral man. And I always find that interesting because it puts the role of moral judge, or the most important final judgment, onto the woman in the story. Somebody who is given the rights of cattle at this point. So it's a contrast, but we're going to look at these two stories, both of which are written by a woman of the time, which I think helps, but they are traditional folklore that she had heard from travelers that came through her family's farm. And we're going to look at examples of the woman being the wisest person in the story. Now, the first one, I think, is kind of a tongue-in-cheek, funny one. And the second one's a little more serious, but it involves sort of wise woman walking a boy through how to deal with a curse. So, that's all I really am going to say on that, because, of course, we came here for stories. What does a king's farm sound like? Let's say a little bit of wind. And just because I'm looking at some rain on my window, let's do a little bit of rain. I'm going to actually turn the music down just a touch. And the fireplace down just a touch. I hope everyone is having a good day. It goes for you as well, Janara. Our first story tonight comes to us from Regine Normann, as will both our stories, from the book Ring Galahorn, which was translated by Simon Roy Hughes, whose works and other translations you can purchase at the pinned comment below if the video is no longer live, and you should. They are excellent. The story is called The Quick-Witted Wife. Now there was once upon a time a couple of folk who lived in a place not far from the king's farm. And the wife was quick to work to turn a profit, but the husband was of the slow sort, preferring to potter around doing everything and nothing. They didn't prosper in their house, therefore. Now, early one morning, when the weather was beautiful, both ashore and at sea, the herring were so plentiful that they swam right up to the rocks on the shore. The boats lay tightly packed, scooping them in bailers and buckets and whatever else the man had at hand. The wife saw this, and as she came from the summer barn with the morning milk, she looked forwards in anticipation of how good the blood-fresh herring would taste. As soon as her husband ambled on up with the herring for frying, then she would begin to make a feast for them. But when she went into the bedchamber, her husband lay beneath the reindeer's skin, sucking on his pipe. "Are you lying here, far into the light of the day, not noticing God's rich gifts swim dry up on the rocks on the foreshore?" she cried, both angrily and heartily confounded. "I don't have a boat," said the husband. "You have the same boat that you've had until now," said the wife. "You've always said that I'm no good at earning or keep," said the husband. "I sold the boat to an itinerant fellow yesterday evening, when you were bringing livestock in from the wild." "Oh, you figment! An imitation of the figure of a man that I've married," sobbed the wife. "But now you shall be so good as to get out of bed, put on your Sunday best, and then you shall go to the king and beg for a gift." Well, the husband did not dare do anything than what his wife commanded in that moment. So he got up, got dressed in his Sunday best, took his staff in his hand, his walking staff, of course, and trotted off, inwardly glad to be out of her sight for a while. When he approached the king's farm, the king stood outside on the step, scattering peas for the doves. The husband did not care to go over to him to bother him with what he had on his heart, and so he stood in the middle of the courtyard staring. "If it is I you would speak with, then come closer," shouted the king. The husband shuffled over to the step and with his hat in his hand said, "God's peace and bless your work." "What is it you would like to say?" asked the king, for he was in a good mood. My wife said that I should beg for a gift. So I have heard, but what manner of gift is it you want? By the way, I don't know how he heard. My wife said I should beg for a gift, repeated the husband, not knowing what else to say. Well, the king, good news, he was in a good mood, said, "Well, there is a fallow field that lies in an inlet south of the king's farm. You and your wife may have it as your legal land," said the king, and the man thanked him and trotted home again. Just a pause because I had to Google it, so I'm sure you do too. Alledal means outright owned, and it's contrasted to feudal, where you basically just work land for someone else. So the king just gave him land. It's a pretty nice king. As the day was waning, the wife and her husband went on to look at their property. "Now, you do afterwards what I do first," said the king. The wife, picking up a loose stick and passing it to him. And then she did something very strange. She took one exactly the same for herself and tramped back and forth across the field. After every 10th step she took, she stopped and knocked on the ground with the stick, and then looked around in different directions, as if she were looking for markers in the treetops. Her husband did what she did, knocking on the ground with his stick and glaring, but neither of them said a word. Now, there were 3 robbers lurking in the forest, and they saw the wife and the fellow walking around like idiots, knocking on the ground, and the chief went over to them, of the robbers, and asked why they went so, running around on the fallow field. "I shall tell you this," said the wife. "My husband has today received this patch of land from the king himself, and a great treasure is supposed to lie buried here. We are walking around listening for the field to find where it's hollow, and tomorrow we shall begin to dig for treasure." But when the wife and the fellow went home from the field, well, the 3 robbers thought best of it, and they came out of that forest, shovels in hand, and began to dig. But of course, though they dug the whole field up from boundary to boundary, they found no treasure for all their digging, because there was, of course, no treasure to find. The wife then came back to the field and planted early potatoes in this so politely and lovely newly dug field that was gifted to her. And they would look for the like of fertile potato land in vain. So she earned a lot of money from selling these potatoes and was happy and content. When the summer was on the wane, though, there was no more potatoes or whatever else to sell, the robber chief, realizing he'd been a little bit tricked, came for all the money, since it was he and his comrades who turned the soil in the field for her after all. Well, she bade him to go back to whence he came, and he left for the time being. Now, there was an evening, a few days later, that the wife was baking barley cakes on the griddle on top of the stove. Someone remind me to talk about barley after this. It was warm, and the door stood a little open, while she walked back and forth between the table and the mixing trough and the griddle on the stove, and in the strip of light from the crack in the doorway she caught a glimpse of the very same robber who had come to her for the money. He was lurking by the woodshed, waiting for the house to grow quiet. Well, that clever wife continued doing what she was doing, pretending nothing was amiss, but then spoke to her husband, who was sitting at the table eating the newly baked barley cakes. But all the time she was out hatching a plan for how she could fool this robber outside. Well, on the floor inside the kitchen doorstep stood a bucket of live crabs, good fierce Arctic crabs, not those fiddly little ones from the south, the kind that could take a finger off. And her husband, in a rare act of productiveness, had brought them home. And as she continued baking, she said loudly enough so anyone who wanted to could hear, "I dreamt last night that an ugly brute of a robber who wanted the money I earned selling the potatoes came and took it from me. But now I'll be clever and hide it in the bucket here, and lay some barley cakes upon it so he'll never find it." Yeah. "Do that," said her husband. When they had gone to bed, and everything was quiet, and the candle had been quenched for the night, that kitchen door, it creaked open. The robber stuck his hand in and took the bucket, and then ran with it to the forest where his two comrades stood waiting for him. Well, they soon helped themselves to the freshly baked cakes, and the chief stuck his hand down deep into the bucket to bring up all that potato money. But he took it out again in much more of a hurry than he thought he might have to, for a crab's claw was clamped onto every single finger. 5! And he was both blue and bloody before they managed to loosen his fingers from their grasp. Well, one evening, not long afterwards, the wife opened the bedroom window to let in some fresh air before she went to bed. And there was there a huge rowan tree who grew outside the window, and up in the top hung a wasp's nest that her lazy old husband wouldn't help with. When she went to close the window again, she saw there was a grown fellow lying stretched out on the ground along the wall, hiding, but poorly. She understood immediately that this was one of the robbers, and quick-witted as she was of nature, she began to tell her husband how she had rolled the money into a ball of wool and bound it in a white kerchief and hung it at the top of the rowan tree. Well, that robber, feeling quite clever, had heard every word she said, and he glimpsed something round and white at the top, the very top of the rowan tree, between its green leaves, and he went into the forest to tell his comrades, and together they slinked back to the rowan. The nimblest of them climbed for the bag, and the other two kept watch close to the trunk. But when he who climbed reached the top and grasped hold of that bundle of cash, he found it to be a nest of wasps who screamed out and stung him on his face and his neck and his hands, and he let go of what he was holding on to and stood waving both hands, trying to save himself from the swarm. Now the other two thought, in the sort of dim light they were in, that what he was doing was putting the money away, that he meant to thieve from them their rightfully thieved gold. And they couldn't call out to him, for that would alert the husband and wife and wake them. So they too began to climb to make certain that their share of the bounty would be won. But of course, they did get their share of the bounty, for what it was wasps all over them immediately, and the robbers struck out, waving around to avoid their swings until the branches broke. And hurt themselves so severely that one had to support the other back to their robber's den. Now the wife understood that the robbers would be after her, however, perhaps to take both the money and her life this time. So she sent her husband out to pick moss and heather, and she sewed it fast to a blood-red eider-down cover. Eider-down, eider is like from a Norwegian bird, sort of like a seagull. It's not really. It's just a very white fluff that was very common in Norway. Probably still is, but was at least at this time. She filled a pouch with ants from an ant hill, tied a ribbon around it, and put the eider-down cover over her head. And she went into the forest to look for their hiding place. And when she had wandered far and at great length, and gone over heath and hill and wilderness, she came to a small green clearing in the midst of the densest forest. What a beautiful clearing it was. For a brook ran through it, and as she was thirsty and exhausted from a day of walking, she lay down to drink. And as she was doing so, she saw a fellow come walking along the brook, a little below where she lay drinking. So she crept back and hid in the undergrowth in the bank, and covered herself with ants. And if you didn't know better, you would have thought it was just a mound of moss and heather crawling with ants. This is what the robber who came with a slaughtered lamb over his shoulder thought. He stopped by the undergrowth, cawed like a raven, and straightway a patch of turf fastened to a pole lifted into the air. And if you don't know what just happened there, he gave a secret call, and their secret base was revealed. Beneath the turf was a dark opening, and when the robber had disappeared through the opening, the turf sank down again and closed the hole behind him. Well, she stuck some sticks in the ground to be sure of being able to find the place again, and crept away, but slowly enough that she could mark the way she had taken. But it was far to where she was going, so twilight fell, and it grew dark and foreboding in the forest. And she heartily wished she were home again. Just as she went, she caught a glimpse of a fire among the tree trunks. And who was it who sat there by the fire but the robber chief, with her pocketbook in his hands? "Oh, you abomination! You've taken all my money while I've been away," she screamed. But when the robber chief heard the frightful scream, and when the light of the fire fell on the blood-red eider-down cover, bedecked with all the moss and heather, he thought it was a forest witch, and he hurled the pocketbook and the money and a large sack of gold and silver at her, and ran away as quickly as his feet would take him. Well, the wife took the sack and the money and considered it a good day's work. Afterwards, she sent her husband to the king with a careful message of where these robbers could be found. And when the king heard of everything the wife had done, he said, "Go home to your wife. Greet her from me, and tell her that you hereafter shall sit on the king's council. For a fellow who has such a quick-witted wife never has occasion to get up to anything himself." We'll come back to that. And so the robbers were rounded up and hanged, and the king took all the treasures they had hoarded beneath the earth. Snip, snap, snout. Hear this tale's told out. Which is how Regine Normann ends all her stories. I see GS is here. Tipstoe's in late. Hello, GS. No problem being late. That was easy to acquire land. Yeah. I'm sure it's not very reflective. GS says, I love robber booby traps. Home Alone in the 18th century. Boy, talk about a good woman behind a successful man. Yeah, so two things. Obviously, the first reaction is, why does the wife receive no reward when she's the one who did everything? But of course, it's not lost on me that this is satire. It might be for you, so I'll sort of explain it. They're basically saying politicians are useless. She's saying that a person who is so well taken care of by clever people has so much idle time and is so useless that they may as well go serve on the king's council. It's a slur against politicians is what it is. Or at least that's the way I take it. Gonna have a drink of water and then we'll get on to the next story. One thing I do, before I move on to the next story, one thing I do like about, or I found interesting about that tale, is the tricking people to till your land is a bit of a trope. I've never seen it done that way, which was clever. But I do remember that we did do a version of, we did a bunch of stories about a fox, sort of the Norwegian version, but also the fox character. I talked about this about a year ago. They were tremendously unpopular videos, but I like doing them. Is sort of a Looney Tunes style character in folklore, and often the fox is the clever one. It's sort of like Bugs Bunny, and he tricks these other people to do stuff. And one of the things that he tricks, I think, a wolf to do is all the tilling and cleaning of the land while he goes and eats the lunch. And he keeps pretending that he has to go to christenings to get away with it. I mean, it's a tale. It's not good in summary. Gennaro says, I thought it was saying that his wife keeps him in line. I like your take too, though. It could be either way. I think I am detecting a note of saltiness, I guess, is what I'm trying to get. I do think there's a target there. Yeah, it's just a story. I could be wrong. Let's do some birds for this, because this takes place down on a beach and is a pretty little setting, a little less densely forested in my mind. Our final story tonight is called The Otter Skin, which also comes to us from Ringella Horn, which is written by Regine Normann, a folklorist and writer from the 19th century, and translated by Simon Roy Hughes, whose other translations, mostly Norwegian works, you can find in the pinned comment below, and you should buy them. They're good. The Otter Skin also shows us a tale of wise woman, but of a different type and a different tone. Now there was once upon a time a small boy who, one Thursday night during a full moon, was allowed to go otter hunting with his father. Now when they came to the bank where the otter's sea path lay, they saw fresh tracks in the sand at the foot of the bank, and they understood that the otter was already in the fjord. So they sat waiting for it to come up again, and the man made sure that the wind blew from the tracks and on to them, not the other way around, which may have scared off the otters. Now, time passed slowly, and the boy was both cold and sleepy. And after midnight, when an otter finally came crawling to land with a fat sea trout in its jaws, it stopped at the top of the beach, looking out for danger. And then suddenly it turned, and the man sent a bullet after it from a great distance. It hit so well that the otter tumbled head over heels and lay kicking, all four paws in the air. But when they came to get their prey, both meat and innards were gone, and only an empty otter skin lay on the white sandy beach. "Watch out! Don't touch it! It's an enchanted otter, not the animal of flesh and blood I thought it was when I sent a bullet after it," cried the man. But the boy had already bent down and touched that silky soft fur, and straightway the skin twisted itself over his head and down over his whole body, transforming him into a big, beautiful otter. His father took him in both hands to wrest the skin off him, but the otter wriggled out of his grasp and disappeared among the rocks at the foot of the bank. He took out his otter call and began to whistle and call. But that too was in vain. The boy in the otter skin did not come back out. Full of bitter grief, the father had to walk the heavy way home to the boy's mother and tell her a grievous tale of what had become of their kind and clever boy. Now, the boy had been turned into an otter, and so he went up the bank, over the rocky shoulder, and out onto the wild heath, far from Christian folk and where they went. It was the skin that took him. The boy had really no will of his own. At great length, they stopped by a round earthen cabin. The door stood open, and there was a flaming fire burning in the midst of the floor. A stiff old woman sat by the fire, feeding the blaze with pliable twigs from switches of gilded birch. The otter shot through the doorway, crept up to the woman, and stood, whimpering and shivering.
"Yeah, now you whimper and shiver,"
said the woman angrily.
"But your father shot my brother last night. Tonight I sent his skin on its way to fetch you. And here you shall stay until someone comes who can release you."
So the boy in the otter skin had to stay out there in the wilderness with the stiff old woman who thought only of avenging herself, and never had a friendly word left for the boy. During the day, he hauled water and wood for her and cooked the food she wanted to eat, and served her as best he could. At night, the skin compelled him down to the fjord and out into the deep, and after fat, delicious fish for her. To begin with, he was afraid of the deep, cold water, but little by little he grew accustomed to it and grew as good at fishing as the other otters he got to know on his way to and from the fjord. Some nights he saw his father sitting on the bank, blowing the otter call, and one night in the full moon, his mother sat there too. Then he laid the juicy fish he was carrying at her feet, so she could see he had been close to her, and then shot down into the fjord after another for his enchantress. But that fish was both lank and limp, and as punishment, the woman singed his whiskers over the fire, so that it was more difficult for him to find his way, both on land and in the water. Well, one day, the enchantress said that she now wanted a silverfish to eat. And then she would wear... and if he could not get her one during the coming night, then she would wear out 7 birch switches across his spine. The boy in the otter skin had never met such a fish in the sea. However, he did not know where he would find one either. So he crept out of the cabin, went to the spring to wet his tongue with the draught of cold, fresh spring water before he set off on his way to the fjord. But as he was about to drink of the water, he saw a small char, which, if you don't know, is a little fish, lying and hovering beneath the edge of the turf. And it spoke.
I am the daughter of the king of the merfolk, the same enchantress who has cast the otter skin on you, has separated me from all my folk. It keeps me captive here in the spring. During the day I am a meager char, but at night I am a princess. And then she troubles and torments me. The silver fish she has sent you to catch tonight, that is my sister. So promise me that, after she has eaten what she wants of the fish, you will take the bones and everything that is left and drop it all into this spring. And then I shall make it so that you meet the silver fish as soon as you come into the fjord.
The otter promised willingly to do what she asked of him. In the light of heart, he ran over the heath and down the bank. The silverfish came towards him with just a few fathoms of land, and he took it in his teeth and carried it up to that earthen cabin, laying it in the woman's lap.
You managed it, she said, laughing cruelly. But tonight you shall catch a golden fish for me. If you do not do it, then I shall wear out 7 birch switches on your back, just so long as you know that.
Well, the otter did not protest, but he dreaded all the beating that awaited him. For he had, he didn't like beating, for one, but he had never seen a goldfish in the fjord. Golden fish, I should say. Probably hasn't seen a goldfish either, to be honest. Not in Norway in this era. And he did not know where he should swim to find one either. When the woman had eaten, the otter took all that remained of the silverfish and dropped it in the spring, and as he had promised the char, rather. And so when evening came, he crept over to the spring again to cool his burning tongue before he went out on this hopeless hunt for the golden fish in the fjord. But when he was about to drink of the spring water, he saw 2 chars lying, lingering beneath the edge of the turf. The golden fish the enchantress has sent you to catch tonight is our youngest sister, said the chars. So if you promise that when she has eaten all she wants of the golden fish, you will take the bones and everything that is left and drop it in the spring, then we will make it so that you meet our sister as soon as you come into the fjord. I certainly promise, said the otter, yet his heart was heavy with discouragement when he went over to the heath and down the bank. The golden fish swam to meet him some fathoms from land, and it was so fine, and it gleamed so sleek that it hurt his eyes, and the boy in the otter skin took it gently between his teeth, carrying it to the earthen cabin and laying it in the enchantress's lap. You managed this too? She said, dropping the fish into the embers.
But tonight, you shall catch a charcoal blackfish for me. And you shall know it by the golden crown it has on its head. And if you do not manage it, then I shall wear out 7 birch switches across your back and rub salt in the open wounds.
Which is grim. When the woman had eaten what she wanted of that golden fish, beautiful as it was, the otter gathered the remains and dropped them in the spring as he had promised. And all day he went in the greatest dread of the beating that awaited him. A black fish with a crown, where would he find that? And when the evening came, he crept to the spring to cool his tongue before he set off across the heath. But when he was about to drink, he saw there were 3 chars over by the edge of the turf. "It is our father she wants you to catch tonight," said the chars. "And it may well be that you manage it, for he has left his castle in grief and swims around in the fjord looking for his daughters. But should the enchantress get a hold of him, then it is over for the merfolk. Be now merciful, and take all 3 of us in your mouth and carry us back to the fjord." "I can do that," said the otter, "but you have human skins at night, and then there will not be room for all 3. "We have fish skins until midnight," said the chars. "Now hurry so that we will not be too late." Well, the otter opened his jaws, and all 3 chars laid themselves in his mouth, and he ran over heath as quickly as he could, over the rocky shoulder and down the bank, and after him came the enchantress, swooping in an owl skin. And it was a matter of life and death, but at the bottom of the bank sat the boy's father, blowing his otter call as he did every night, his rifle lying beside him. And when he saw that otter sweep past him like a shot, as quick as a shadow, and the screeching owl descending on him, he was not slow to put a bullet in that enchanted bird. As soon as the owl tumbled to the ground, the otter skin burst, and the boy stood there free and easy, with the 3 gleaming small chars in one hand. Carefully he carried them down to the water's edge and released them out into the fjord. And he thought they clearly cried their thanks, even though he had lost his understanding of their fish tongue when he turned back into a human. And snip, snap, snout, this tale's told out. Which, if you're anything like me, feels like an abrupt end to the tale, but I guess not every tale needs to have gold and the princess and everything's happily ever after. Sometimes it's enough to just go home. Gia says, "Not the dreaded whisker singeing." Yeah, that's such a specifically cruel thing. Gia says, "This is getting complicated. Got to be careful whose sibling you're killing." Imagine that without context. All right. Well, I mean, we got through those stories quicker than I thought. Gia says that was elaborate. You know what I think? I know I say this a lot. And I know that even the translators who know far more about this than me disagree about this. But stories like that strike me as post-Christianization pagan tales. I mean, we're talking about things that, wear owl skins and otter skins and that sort of shape-shifting, and princesses that are being tormented and freed by heroes and stuff like that. That is very mythology sounding. It sounds like these were pagan gods that have sort of been recast. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that Odin's wife, why can I not think of her name? Anyways, I believe she has an owl skin. She was a huntress as well. But I genuinely do not remember her name. Anyways, which is shameful because I know it very well. Yeah, anyways, the point is that the story strikes me very much as an early pre-Christian sort of story that has been run through a filter where all the gods' names have been sanded off, so they're not called, Loki or whatever else, or whatever it could have been. I don't know. And Gia says, too late, I'm quoting you. Well, nonetheless, let's stop the sounds here. I really do recommend Regine Normann's book. We're eventually probably going to... there goes my light. We are probably eventually going to... There we go. We are probably eventually going to get through all of them, but if you are impatient and want to... Genera says, more than likely a lot of pagan stories have been changed. Definitely. I mean, that is an undeniable fact. I guess what I'm hesitant about is I know that the scholarship around it, people who know better than me, exactly how much that happens is debatable. So I'm just trying to frame it as I don't know everything. I don't know most things. I'm a storyteller and a writer for the most part. But yes, unfortunately, almost every pagan story is seen through a filter like that. Actually, I mentioned the fox earlier. The fox that appears in multiple, from as far southeast as Ukraine, all the way up to like Ireland and Scotland and Norway and Iceland and so on. You get this fox character generally represented in a very similar way, sometimes the same tales, separated by quite a bit. It's hard for me not to see the fox as a recontextualized pagan god of the forest, a sort of chaos god, because he really reads that way to me. But I have no proof, right? So I'm sure proof is out there, but I don't have it. So that's all. I'm just sort of framing my arguments a bit. But nonetheless, Ringalahorn was by the lovely Regine Normann, who, well, she's long passed. Her legacy is not quite as much as she deserves, because she is an excellent writer. If you want to hear some other stuff from her, I have read from her works before. I read Maiden Rosenwing and the Santavaha Isle, I think 2 weeks ago, which is also from this book, and I really enjoyed that one. That's sort of a reversed East of the West. No, I did that again. East of the Sun, West of the Moon, not East of the West. It's sort of a reversed East of the Sun, West of the Moon version of the tale, if you know that tale. If you don't, you could kind of argue, although I think this is the thin premise, you could kind of argue that Beauty and the Beast is a version of the trope of East of the Sun, West of the Moon. But anyways, that is a story that she wrote from here that was very lovely. And there was a story that we did a while ago about a woman who was trapped alone on a beach with her son. And I think it's the merman's son, but I cannot remember what I called that episode, so maybe I'll link it below if I remember. Nonetheless, this isn't what people came here for, so I will say thank you so much for everybody who tuned in and sat by the fire while I told stories. If you do feel so inclined, the best way to give a little applause and say, hey, thank you for the story, is to give the video a like. This is niche enough that the like thing is not like most people, me trying to play an algorithm. The algorithm hates this show, and it always will. It's not exciting, super well retention or whatever. They're long kind of stories. It's for a very niche audience. No, the likes are just there because they help me know that some people enjoyed this. So if you did, feel free to do so. If you really do like it, there is a whole playlist of this, and you can consider subscribing, because that's a way to know what's coming up if it's something interesting to you. But beyond that, I won't babble anymore. I will just say thank you so much for everybody who lingered in the background and those who joined me in the chat. Genera and GS, thank you very much for keeping me company while I told the stories tonight. You have yourself a good sleep, because I'll keep the fire warm.